here. And we have Jonathan Hill presenting this week. And I think probably most everyone on the show and everyone watching went to the eclipse or tried to go to the eclipse and probably tried to take a photograph and then did some processing and was very proud of what they did. I know I was. It was like, I got the money shot. But then I was looking around and I thought Jonathan Hill's money shot on the eclipse, and I go, oh my gosh, what is that? We have to find out how that was done. And Jonathan and I chatted a little bit about that. And I said, you have to come on and explain all this because was just an incredible. If you haven't seen your shot, you will tonight, and you will say the same thing. It showed more detail than I have ever seen in any eclipse shot. But before we get to Jonathan, next week we won't have a show because is there something going on next week we should talk about? Oh yeah, Super Bowl. I forgot about that. Yeah, really, I didn't forget about that. But the week after that, we have Rolf Olsen, who is going to give us a presentation on Centaurus A. Believe it or not, a 10-year exposure of some, not actually 10 years sequentially, of course, but data gathered over 10 years with some incredible detail. So Ralph, you want to kind of give us an introduction to what you're going to present?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Eric. So yeah, as you said, I'm going to talk about this Centaurus A image. So I started this project 11 years ago now. And I just wanted in the beginning to sort of gather as much data as I could on this thing and maybe break the 100-hour limit, which back then I don't think any amateur had done. I got enough data and had a pretty good image back then. And then it sort of, I just got carried away and I thought I need some more data on this thing. There are more features hiding in there, So this galaxy has some amazing hydrogen alpha jets that extend for thousands of light years. So in my new image, which has more than 300 hours of exposure, there's some previously unseen details, and there's like more than 1100 of the globular clusters in Centaurus A, stuff like that. So I'm going to do a little talk on how the image was done, the image processing, and all these interesting things you can see in the image.
It's an incredible image. Once again, if we've done it before, we look at that and go, well, we better cross that off our list. It's already been done. After that, we have Christian Worley, who's going to talk about touching stars. And after that, on March 2nd, we have an opening. And like we do every week, we need people to come on and give presentations. So raise your hand, go to our theastroimagingchannel.org. There's a little contact button and say, hey, listen, I have something interesting to say. And I think most of us have something interesting to say. Put your name in, we'll get in contact with you, and likely you'll be on the show. That's our open. After that, we have a couple of people coming up. Dustin Brimberry, who we had to reschedule. Brave Falls is going to tell us about the new observatory. Christian Sassy. We have some really nice presentations coming up in a few weeks, but we'd like to fill that open one. Now, before we get going with Jonathan, Alex?
Hi, everybody. As you know, we're always looking for presenters, and Marcia Wilcox from up the Boston way has volunteered to do a presentation, organize it with some other people. She's been involved in making some collaborative productions where she takes some of the pictures, other people take others of the pictures, and they get together, share their best data, and put out a really cool picture. And she's done this a couple of times, and she knows that there's other people out there who've done that. She would like some help in presenting that kind of a show for people. And in order to make it known that you would like to contact her and be part of that presentation, it'll be coming up in 6 weeks. I don't know when exactly, but you get some time to work on it and figure out what's happening. Anyway, I'm going to share my screen for a second. My whole screen. That's weird. I'm just going to share my entire screen because I can figure that out. Boink, boink. Okay. And get, oh, then I'm going to go here and then I'm going to make that huge. If you come to this site or at the astroimagingchannel.org, you will see that someplace up there, there's contact. And contact us. Tell us your first name and your last name, what your email address is. And just in the comment box here, just say that you'd like to help with the collaboration, that you've been involved in some collaborations and things like that. And I will get that information to Marcia so she can go ahead and take care of that. And now I will stop sharing. So we're always looking for presenters, and you can use that same contact sheet to tell us you'd like to make a presentation. But in particular, where Marcia is looking for some people to collaborate with her collaboration presentation. And that's enough for me. Thank you, Eric.
And collaborations, I don't want to say they're a big thing now, but they certainly are a lot bigger than they were 5 or 10 years ago. And I think you can produce higher quality images with a variety of scopes and people contributing to it. And you won't get exhausted. Unlike Ralph, who seems to never get exhausted, who's done this for 10 years, which is incredible. Well, before we go any further just chatting, Jonathan, would you like to tell us a little bit about eclipse processing?
Absolutely. Let me go ahead and share the presentation.
It's all yours.
All right. Okay. Confirming y'all can see that.
Yeah. We're all good. If we're all shut off our cameras and mute ourselves, we'll be good to go.
All right. All right. Well, hey, everybody. How's it going? Good evening. Thanks to the Astro Imaging Channel guys for having me on. I'm really excited to share with you guys the most recent 2024 solar eclipse of my pictures, as well as all the processing techniques and capture techniques I used in the process. A lot of this stuff isn't covered in a lot of places online, so this will be one of the first places you see it in more detail. So I'm excited to share this with all you guys. And if you have any questions, I'll be stopping several times throughout the presentation to take those. So just throw them in the chat there on the stream if you do have them, and we can get to them. All right, so here's a little bit about what we're going to cover. So I'll show you all my 2024 eclipse images. For the new folks, we'll talk about what even an eclipse is and the different types. We'll go over some of the unique challenges and conditions that show up when you photograph an eclipse. And then I'll go into the capture techniques of how to optimize your imaging sequence to get the most out of your short, eclipse time frame. And then we'll get into the real fun stuff, which is the processing techniques. All right, so who's the guy talking right now? So I am an engineer. I currently live in Alabama, do vibration and shock testing, my daily workload. But I've been doing astrophotography since 2017. I got my first DSLR camera then, and it's just been a blast diving down the rabbit hole ever since then. You can see some of my equipment there on the right. 2024 is my second total solar eclipse. The one in 2017 was incredible. I witnessed that one from South Carolina at my grandparents' house. And then we drove all the way to Arkansas for this most recent one. And we're fortunate enough to have clear enough skies to get some great pictures. Okay, so we'll get into my 2024 images here. So this is the gear that we took out to Arkansas. I was shooting with 4 systems. There's actually a 5th system that I haven't included here, but that one didn't take any pictures because I made a mistake. But so system 1 was my highest focal length. It was a Nikon 800 on my CEM70 mount. System 2 was 300 millimeters, and system 3 was 105. And then system 4 was doing a wide angle time lapse, which is actually the background of this presentation. So you'll see some of those pictures coming up here in a second. So these focal lengths allowed me to get a really zoomed in view, a medium focal length view, and a nice wide view. So I was able to capture pretty much all the phenomena that you saw during the total solar eclipse. So here's my highest focal length image. This one I'm really, really excited about how it turned out detail-wise. So this is a combination of that system 1 and system 2 setups. So I use the 800 millimeter focal length for all of the intercoronal details, and then the 300 millimeter was shooting a different sequence, and that's what I used for the external, the outermost corona. So it allowed me to capture a lot more exposure time using two systems. And here's the image from the 300 sequence. Again, I used both System 1 and System 2 data for this one picture. I was able to resize the 800 millimeter data to fit there in the inner corona. So I got more high resolution details than I would have captured with the 300 millimeter alone. And then the 105, I'm actually still working on. I had to rewrite some of my software to work with the way I captured those images. So y'all follow me on social media or stay tuned for this image. It'll be really exciting, and hopefully it'll show a lot of stars in the field of view as well, kind of like the 300 picture. All right, so for those of you who are new, most of you know what an eclipse is, but for those who are kind of new to this, there's two types of eclipses that people photograph for the most part. One's a lunar eclipse, one's a solar eclipse. Usually it deals with where the moon is in relation to the Earth. You see up here on the right. A lunar eclipse is when the moon is behind the Earth in relation to the sun, and a solar eclipse is when the moon is in front of the Earth in relation to the sun. And so a lunar eclipse gives this nice red blood moon effect. And so you're seeing the Earth's shadow there cast onto the moon. So then a solar eclipse, this is the really, really cool one. These are very rare. So if you ever get a chance to see one of these, definitely get out and see it. But you see the moon is actually blocking our view of the sun. And we're seeing the sun's outer atmosphere here in the corona. It's an unbelievable experience. And we were fortunate enough to see the annular eclipse as well in 2023. That was where the moon is just slightly smaller than the sun. So you get this cool ring of fire effect. So generally the sun's corona, this is kind of what it looks like in most eclipses. The shape varies, but like I said earlier, it's the sun's outermost atmosphere. You're not actually capturing the surface of the sun when you capture an eclipse, so it's safe to view with your eyes. And it has lots of components here, but you see I got the moon labeled here in the middle, which is blocking the sun's disk. And you see a little bit of the solar photosphere showing through there, which is the actual surface of the sun. And then you got these coronal loops that show up, and this is the atmosphere of the sun following magnetic field lines, which is really interesting. And then you got streamers here, which are these long wispy bits that extend outwards radially from the sun. All these features are visible in every solar eclipse, and that's the detail that we enhance in our pictures. So it actually extends millions of miles into space, which is really interesting, and scientists are still studying the solar corona quite heavily now. So solar eclipses are really unique to capture, and they offer a lot of challenges as opposed to normal daytime and nighttime photography. Um, I'm assuming y'all know a little bit about normal nighttime astrophotography and kind of that workflow with this presentation. So if y'all have any questions, like I said, just throw them in the chat there, and we'll get to them when we can. So some of the challenges here are that you're setting up your equipment in the daytime because the eclipse happens during the daytime. So normal things like polar alignment and focusing on stars you can't do because you don't see any stars. So that's an issue you got to tackle. And the solar disk is also visible during the partial phases. And that'll literally melt your camera sensor if you point your camera at it without proper filtering. There's also extreme convective and radiative heat changes, which can contribute to focus shift or your camera gear heating up really fast and cooling down really fast. The corona's brightness is unbelievable. It's 14 exposure values of stops, which means basically it's 14 times brighter on the outer corona than on the inner, or on the inner corona than on the outer corona. And so that's an extreme challenge for photographing with camera sensors that are limited in the dynamic range they can capture. You're also limited on camera sequence limitations. So most cameras are limited to a certain amount of pictures they can take per second, and you know what the settings can be. So that's another challenge. And also the eclipses usually only last for a minute or two. So you have to do all this capturing within a couple minutes. So it's a really high stakes event. So some of these capturing techniques I'll go over will help, I guess, maximize the amount of pictures you can get during the total solar eclipse, as well as optimizing in what order you take everything. So when you're choosing a focal length, you got to choose what you want to primarily capture in the eclipse. So here's an example of 3 of the focal lengths I considered for the eclipse. See the 800 millimeter there gets really zoomed in, But the 300 millimeters still gets a lot of great details, but it shows a lot more of the outer corona that you miss out with the 800. The 135 there, we ended up going with a 105 because it was a little bit wider, but you get to capture any planets if they're in the field of view, any comets, a whole lot more stars, as well as the outermost extent of the corona and diffuse corona with those setups. So in our case, we used all three setups, but you can obviously choose whatever you like to capture, whatever field of view you want to capture. So camera shutter, this is an issue that is, primarily hardware-wise for the cameras when you capture an eclipse. The main issue is that vibration from your camera shutter as the mirror flips up if you have a DSLR, or as the shutter actually closes on your mirrorless camera, that can cause vibrations, especially at high focal lengths, meaning your pictures will become blurry. So if you're using a DSLR, you'll want to use mirror lockup mode, or a mirrorless camera, you'll want to shoot in silent shooting. This is a great article here that explains what electronic front curtain shutter is, which basically is what you enable when you enable silent mode. This will let your camera silently capture and capture faster images without introducing any vibration into your optical system. So a tracking mount, most of y'all know what that is because a lot of y'all are astronomers. But if you're new to that, a tracking mount is basically a gearbox that rotates your camera with the rotation of the Earth. It can keep your whatever you're viewing in your camera field of view in the center of the frame a lot longer than just a stationary tripod will. It'll also let you point directly at the sun. You won't have to, guess where it's going to be in 20 minutes. So it allows you to have better framing consistency and reducing your guesswork. Like I said a second ago, most of your imaging for an eclipse can be done with a stationary tripod, but it's much more difficult, especially at a higher focal length. So we got our camera, we got our focal length telescope, we got our mount set up. Now, how do we focus properly on the sun? And what kind of filters do we need? So in order to look at the sun through a camera, you got to have something called a solar filter, which will filter out most of the light coming from the sun's disk and allow you to actually see details on the sun's surface. This is an example of a sunspot you may see, and this is a key feature that's beneficial to focus on. So a lot of people will focus once during eclipse. They'll focus, a couple minutes or a couple hours for totality, and then they'll call it quits there. One of the best things you could do is to focus even closer to totality, because like I said, as the air cools down, the heat currents will change in the atmosphere and everything, and you'll get less radiative heat transfer go into your camera and telescope system, meaning your lens will expand or contract, and it will change the focus point of your camera and scope, meaning you gotta refocus if you want everything to be sharp. So what I do is I focus about 1 or 2 hours before totality on a sunspot. That lets me take my flat frames. And then about 10 minutes before totality, I focus on what's called the horn of the moon, which is this point here. And this is the best place you can focus because you're easily going to be able to tell if that point is sharp or out of focus. It'll look blurry and not pointy if it's out of focus. It'll be razor sharp if it is. And so what I would recommend as far as solar filters go is you want a sharp solar filter and not a blurry one, because you're going to want to make sure that you get the sharpest image that you're focusing on too. So I recommend this Astro Solar Beta film. It's the sharpest film that I've tried, and I actually used it for this eclipse. Oh, another tip is to cover your equipment with a tent up until about 10 or 20 minutes before totality, and that'll minimize the effects of radiative heat transfer on your system. Okay, so building a filter, a lot of this solar film comes in rolls, so you can cut out a square, but then you either have to attach it to your camera system with a rubber band or something. Joe Calley is a fella who made up an awesome technique for making solar filters, and I use this for the eclipse. It's basically a combination of foam board that you sandwich your solar film in between, and you can easily remove the filter with these binder clips. This is kind of a diagram here. So I got my filters between two pieces of foam board, and another piece of foam board actually permanently attached to the telescope hood. It's got a hole in it, which is the diameter of the telescope or lens hood, and so it always stays on. And when you want to attach or remove the filter, you just got to remove the binder clips, and it easily comes off. This is a great method because it doesn't, it prevents you from, hitting the focuser or shifting into the optics in your system right before totality as you remove your filters. So y'all check out, you can do a Google search on Joe Calley and his tutorials out there if y'all want to follow along. It's a great method. Okay, so the last thing, now we're in focus, we got all our gear set up. What is our actual imaging sequence we're going to follow? So most cameras can do what's called auto exposure bracketing, which is where the camera will take a series of pictures at different exposure value differences. So if you set it to take, 5 pictures at 2 EV steps, it'll take, 5 pictures in sequence, but it'll adjust the exposure in between to make the picture brighter. And so for most cameras, you're limited to about 9:1 exposure value. So you're limited to either 9 or 10 stops of dynamic range. And like I mentioned earlier, you need 14 to cover the entire dynamic range of the solar corona. So that this introduces an issue because you can't capture the entire corona with one camera system unless you use an external method. And so some ways you can do that is you can use multiple setups, kind of like we did, or you can use an external sequencer, kind of like Eclipse Maestro, Orchestrator, or a custom Python code or another code you can run. I found multiple setups to be nice because you don't have to fiddle with a laptop during the eclipse. It's just one less failure point. Now it is more expensive, but I thought it was definitely a worth it investment for the eclipse. And also, you don't want to go much over 2 exposure values in spacing between your exposures. You start running into issues with your HDR blend if you go up into 3 EV. It'll usually work, but you may get some higher noise areas than you want. Here's an example of what I was saying with multiple setups. I use Camera One system to capture this exposure range here. And so it was mainly exposing the inner corona up to about 8 or 10 EVs. Camera 2 with the 300 millimeter lens was capturing the middle and outer corona. And then camera 3 was just the outer corona with a lot of stars in there just for long exposures. So this is how I triggered all my systems with just a basic intervalometer. You can find these on Amazon or any other astro or photo website. These are awesome because they just plug into your camera and you can shoot in one of 2 modes. You can do interval shooting, which you'll choose, you choose an interval to shoot. So, you shoot for 3 seconds and then you tell it to wait 5 seconds and then take another picture and do that, X number of times. And this is great because, you can do time lapses with it or anything else, but this is great because I'll show you something here in a second on how to, you can get it to take an exposure bracket every 2 seconds or every 3 seconds. And so then you can tell it to repeat, a couple hundred times, and your camera will repeat that bracketing sequence until you tell it to stop. You can also shoot in continuous shooting mode, which is this little button here. You just hold it down and lock it in place, and it'll trigger the camera as fast as possible to take the same exposure it's set to. That's what I used on the widest field of view scope that we did. So here's an example. I used a spreadsheet to kind of lay out my shooting sequence. That was a really beneficial thing for me to do because I was able to calculate how long the sequence would run for and make sure I was covering all of totality. And I used a big one to plan all my focal lengths and all the shooting sequences and everything. And so my 800 and 300 sequence were in that interval mode for the intervalometer, and they had all these settings. So if y'all want to use these for later, either take a screenshot or a photo or something. And I had to repeat 150 times, and that covered me about 5 minutes of a 4-minute totality. So I shot for 30 seconds on the front and back. So that ensured I captured the whole totality. And then for my 105 sequence, I used the continuous shooting mode. And so I just locked that camera shutter down, and it shot for the full 5 minutes and just captured images the whole time at a 1/3 of a second. So here's some miscellaneous techniques. A faster lens, which means a lower f ratio lens, will allow you to acquire more images in a short amount of time. But the one caveat with this is your lens quality really matters. A lot of really fast or low aperture lenses aren't as high quality as they should be, and so they'll introduce what's called ghosting and flaring, and that'll cause an issue later with your HDR blend and your alignment. And it'll also cause little effects of little halos and things throughout your image that that'll degrade the quality of your image. Another thing I recommend is to use a CF Express card slot if you have one. These cards have a much higher read and write speed, so you can capture images much quicker, and you're only limited by the write speed of your camera, which is great. So then also you want to check, this is something I didn't even think about that one of my friends recommended me to check. You want to make sure if your eclipse is near, noontime, solar noon, you want to make sure that your camera is going to be pointing on the correct side of the meridian when totality starts. If it doesn't, your camera is going to run into the tripod. So a meridian flip is basically you want to swap the telescope onto the correct side of the mount so it'll keep tracking. A lot of y'all will know what that is. And the biggest thing of all is you want to test. So you got to make sure your sequence is run several times at home before you go out and shoot the eclipse, because once the eclipse happens, you can't really adjust anything. So check your camera's battery if your whole sequence or if your camera battery can last a whole sequence, and especially to take calibration frames. Test which order to remove your filters, and how to walk around your setups to avoid kicking or bumping things. That's a big one that's important, especially if you're shooting with multiple setups. Okay. So now that I've gone through that, are there any questions that y'all have seen in the chat? There's a lot we covered, but
yeah, not yet. I'm encouraging people to remember to ask their questions. Ask your questions, people.
Thanks, Molly.
Yeah.
And if y'all think of questions later, feel free to either shoot me a DM on social media, or y'all can shoot me an email as well. I'll have all that information at the end of the presentation. Okay, so we've taken all our great pictures. We've captured them during the eclipse. Now what do we do with them to turn them into a nice picture? Here are some of the main steps here, and the assumptions I'm making in this section is that you kind of understand the basic steps of image processing or astrophotography image processing. And hopefully, if you don't know those basic steps, you can pick up some of that along the way. And another assumption is you have a general understanding of math, because these are numerical methods rather than just analog type methods. So they will involve some math to them. But I will emphasize that you don't need a master's degree to understand any of this stuff, or a degree in math. You don't even have to have the ability to code to do any of these steps. About a year and a half ago, I knew zero about coding. I didn't know anything about numerical image processing. And with about a year and a half, with some help of friends and ChatGPT and MATLAB Q&As, I was able to figure out how to implement a lot of this stuff. And there's a lot of great resources online that can help you out. These specific techniques are not implemented in any commercial software that I know of. So the steps must be done manually via a coding platform like MATLAB or Python. And those are very easy to use, and they have a ton of documentation out that will help you fill in the gaps if you don't know much about them. Okay, so why would we even bother doing all this advanced processing when Photoshop's a great tool? And Photoshop is amazing. I actually use it in my workflow. But here's an example of the difference between an image captured in 2017 that I processed only in Photoshop, and then an image that the 800 millimeter image I showed y'all a few minutes ago. So Photoshop is extremely powerful, and it has a lot of amazing tools, but they're built mainly for image processing. And so you'll hit a limit on the quality of the image you can produce using Photoshop alone, even if you have a really high quality data set. So mainly because it processes images in their nonlinear state. And I can get into that a little bit later, but you hit a really a quick limit in the amount of detail you're able to pull out if you only use Photoshop. So I highly recommend looking into this if you really want to squeeze out every bit of detail you can from your pictures. Okay, so the first step in any processing flow is making sure the features in your images are all properly aligned with one another. And that's what registration is. So we have a couple methods we can use. There's features in the image that we can try to align our pictures on. So we can look at the stars in our pictures. One of the benefits of this is that there's a ton of tools that do this. PixInsight, AstroPixel Processor, Deep Sky Stacker. A lot of these programs already do the star registration method. The only downside is that stars aren't visible in all your frames, particularly if you have a high focal length, or if you have really lower exposures, like you capture the inner corona. So that one's not going to necessarily give us the best quality. And so we could try the moon maybe, but the moon is detectable in all your frames, which is great because you're capturing a picture of the moon. It's very simple to implement because it's just circle detection. But The downsides of that are the moon may be overexposed in your longer exposure pictures, which would cause the moon to be different sizes between your frames. And also the moon and the stars both move at a different rate relative to us than the sun does. So if you align on the stars or the moon, it'll blur the corona and the sun in your pictures. So this leaves one more thing we can use, and we can try to use the corona itself, which means that the coronal features will be aligned perfectly with one another. The only downside is it's a little complicated to implement, and the moon and the stars will be blurred. So you'll have to compensate for the moon and the stars in a separate manner. So that's our method we're going to be outlining here. So the coronal structures, as you saw in my picture earlier, before enhancement, have a very low contrast in comparison to the rest of the image. So something called a frequency-based alignment method excels in this area if we can well isolate these structures of the corona. And so this method is called a modified phase correlation. Phase correlation is a really widely known algorithm that's used for image registration on your phone, in many PCs that align images. It's used pretty much everywhere when you align pictures together that have a lot of structure to them. It's based in the Fourier transform and in the frequency domain. And that basically, I'll get into more details of that here in a second. This method was proposed by Professor Druckmuller, who is actually the pioneer of all these methods I'm going to detail today. His papers are available out there if you want to read them. He does a lot better job explaining them than I do. But I'm going to try to outline them as best I can here for y'all. So here is a key concept you have to understand before we get into the alignment. Complex signals, so any kind of picture or a 2D signal, is just composed of a bunch of simpler signals. So at each one of those simpler signals is at a particular frequency. The higher frequencies are basically fast changes in amplitude. So that would represent here as the amplitude moves up and down really quickly. That's a fast change, which is a high frequency. And a low frequency is a slow change in amplitude, which is the general trend of this line here. So we can actually separate these signals out using something called high pass or low pass filters. And you see how the low frequency here appears once we apply a low pass filter, and it filters out all this high frequency information, which is the rapid change in amplitude. And the cool thing is, if we just add these two signals back together, we get our original signal again. So there's no image data lost. And a cool concept here is that, yes, this is in 1D here, but images are just 2D signals. So we can apply these same concepts to images. So like I said here, we can split the image, which is just a 2D signal, into its high and low frequency components as well. So if we apply a low pass filter, which is just a blur, we can blur it at, this is 20 pixels as an example. It blurs all these really fine details you see in the eyelashes and the iris of the eye. Instead, we get general areas of brightness. And then if we apply a high pass filter, everything below that 20 pixels in size gets emphasized. So you really see all the details in the eyebrow, the skin texture, everything here is really emphasized. Again, if you add them back together again, you get the original photo. So when you apply a high pass filter, you emphasize all of these really fine details that are hidden by this low frequency brightness. And that applies to the corona as well. So a high pass filter will help us isolate the coronal structures, which are sharp like this, from the diffuse bright corona like this. So the general method that Druckmuller outlines is modified phase correlation. You can ignore this formula up here for now. This is just a cross correlation. So the general method goes something like this. You apply a filter to the image that isolates the coronal structures, and we talked about that a second ago. That's just a high pass filter. And then we remove any other high contrast structures, because a frequency-based alignment method is going to snap onto the higher contrast structures in the image, because that's going to give you a higher frequency in the frequency domain. So if we remove the moon, we remove the stars, and we remove the image edges, those are all really sharp, contrasty edges in the picture. And then step 3, we would apply this formula, which I'll get into in a second. And then step 4 is the inverse Fourier transform of the step 3 image gives you a translation vector, which is basically the amount by which you need to shift the image left or right or up or down to get the images to align. So step 1, we apply a high pass filter. This can be done in Photoshop. You can use their high pass filter option. You can get an image just like this, or you can do something in MATLAB as well. There's plenty of functions out there that can do it for you. Another note here is if we apply this filter in a specific direction, orthogonal to the coronal structures, it will emphasize the structures better than just a normal X and Y high pass filter. I'll get into what that means later. You don't really need to understand that now, but it's really helpful for the enhancement stage later. We also want to remove the contrasty structures like the image edge and the moon and stars. So we can do that by just applying a mask. We can just paint black or paint gray over the moon and paint over the edges as well. Like I said, you can do all this in Photoshop as well, but I've done it in MATLAB, so it's automated and a little faster. So then step 3 would be to phase correlate the images, and that means, well, actually, let me go back real quick. So the purpose of doing this is, like I said earlier, we're gonna isolate these coronal structures, which these are not visible in your raw eclipse pictures because they're hidden by that big brightness gradient, which is a lot higher in magnitude than these tiny features. So this is a pre-processing step for our images that we then will apply this formula here to. So basically, this is relating and correlating the phase information of both images and finding a translation vector from it. I'm not going to go into too much depth of the phase correlation because I'm going to butcher it in comparison to what a lot of people online can explain. So I would, if you're curious about that, I'm going to include several links at the end of this slideshow that will kind of give you some more information on that, as well as kind of point you to a Google search. There's a ton of resources on MATLAB Q&A forums, on just straight up tutorials or even YouTube videos on what this is here exactly. But so I won't get into the crazy big details of this for those of you who may get bored from it. But this will basically give you, when you take the inverse Fourier transform of this cross correlation, you will get an image that looks like this. And basically the global maximum of your picture here that you get from the output of this function is a pixel in one location that gives you the translation vector we were talking about, and which is the amount by which you need to shift your image up, down, left, right to then make the images align. And so this peak can vary in shape and size, and that by doing this filtering here is going to help that peak stand out a lot more compared to the rest of the background. So you see there's our global maximum. And so basically the concept here is that you would apply this filter previously to all your images. So all your images would look like that gray picture in the previous slide. And then you would run all those pictures through this formula here. And then that would give you a bunch of translation vectors, which then you can shift all your images by those translation vectors, and it'll give you images that are all perfectly aligned to one another. Okay. Any questions on that section, Molly? Or I know it was a ton to kind of breeze through, but
yeah, there's a couple. Let's see, let me go back up here. So going back a little further in your presentation, do all of your 0 EV to 15 EV exposures combine to the final image? I'm assuming it means the variety of exposure times.
Yeah, they do. So one of the benefits of shooting with 3 setups like I did is that you get 3 different focal length images, and you have to, rescale the images from the 800 millimeter system and the 300 millimeter system to fit the size of the 105 image. But you can do that in post-processing in Photoshop or in PixInsight as well. So since I'm only covering a small section of that total exposure range with each camera system, the plan is to sub each camera captured into all the other images. And so, like I mentioned earlier in the slideshow, the 800 millimeter picture is actually composed of data from both the 800 and the 300 system. And the 105 picture will be composed with data from all 3 systems. So
Okay.
hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think your chart makes that easy to see, is the one that's behind the slide.
Yes. Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely. So y'all can look at this real quick while we're looking. Any other questions that we see?
Yes. So how did you choose MATLAB over another coding language or platform?
So I took one MATLAB course in college, and I really like their documentation. they have a ton of really in-depth documentation on all of their functions, and they also have a lot of good built-in image toolboxes for some of their licenses. Now you do have to pay for MATLAB, and so I got the student license, which comes with 10 different toolboxes that make things a lot easier. One of those is the image processing toolbox, which gives you high-pass filters, low-pass filters, all those things. But another great option, like I said, is Python. I just didn't know any Python yet, so I actually tried starting this process in Python. And since I was already familiar with MATLAB, I kind of said, I'll learn Python later, and I switched back to MATLAB. So MATLAB is also great because it inherently is for matrix operations, and images are essentially just giant matrices. Each pixel value is a number, and it's just a giant square matrix. So a lot of MATLAB's tools are geared towards matrix processing.
Yeah, that's true. Matt Penn wants to know, have you looked at using a GNU Octave, which is like Octave is similar to MATLAB, but the free version, I guess.
So actually, I only heard about that probably about 2 weeks ago. I didn't look too much into it, but it looks really interesting, and it says, I think, that most of the functions are compatible with that software. That if you write one in MATLAB, it'll be compatible there. So I may look into that at some point if we're going to make this project kind of open source.
I will say too that, like, depending on what packages in MATLAB you're using, sometimes converting MATLAB code to Python code is literally line for line pretty much the exact same with a couple of syntax differences.
Absolutely.
Especially using like the NumPy and matplotlib functions and stuff like that.
Yes, absolutely. And those were the ones I was experimenting with before I gave up and went back to MATLAB. So,
Jonathan, I have a question. You say you could use the high pass filters in Photoshop?
Yes, sir.
So what pixel value did you choose?
So for the picture I showed y'all earlier, let me just go back so we can have that for reference. So this is a 8-pixel high pass filter. And since I applied this in the tangential direction, it's going to look a little bit different than what Photoshop will show you. But you want to use a small enough filter size where fine enough structures will show up. If you use a pixel size of 64, it'll show you really big streamers, and you'll have very little noise, but those streamers will be really wide, and there'll be a lot of leeway in the accuracy of your alignment. So you want to use a small enough filter size to bring out the kernel structures without emphasizing the noise too much.
So have you thought about using multiple high pass filters and then combining them?
So for alignment, I haven't actually. That's done in the enhancement step, so I can talk about that, how I do that a little bit later. But for images of the inner corona specifically, very, very short exposures, I think that may be really beneficial because when you get that close to the lunar limb, the details are pretty hard to come by in comparison to the moon's edge. So honestly, a larger size filter combined with some smaller filters may be beneficial there. That'd be something I'd be curious to test.
Okay, thank you.
A couple more questions here. Christian wants to know if you sell your prints.
I do, yes. So if you'll reach out to me on either Instagram or by email, which I'll have at the end of this slideshow, I can get working with you on that.
Cool. And just for everyone's awareness, I have his Instagram, Astrobin, and a couple other links in the video description for you to go easily grab as well. All right, let's see. Let's see, there was another one that I missed here. Oh yeah, so Andre says has a question that he says that he thinks that you've answered. I think you're gonna go into a little more detail, but the longer the eclipse, the longer the lunar movement. How do you compensate for the moon motion on your stack?
That's a really good question. So there's a couple ways you can do that. The one I'm going to detail here involves when you stack your pictures. So let's assume that we got all of our pictures aligned for each sub-exposure. You got your 1/4000 pictures, your 1/1000 pictures, your 2-second pictures. You have each one of those exposure bins. And so what I do for these pictures that I showed y'all is I stacked all of those pictures into one in Photoshop. So I created a master, or not in Photoshop, in PixInsight. I created a master exposure for each exposure bin. And that, the moon is obviously going to be blurred in that stacked photo. So what I did is I created a moon mask of the moon at its first position in the eclipse and its last position in the eclipse. And if you you take the maximum of those two, you basically get an oval shape, which is the moon's whole motion during the eclipse. And so I stacked one set of images with an average blending mode, and then a second set of images of the same exposure value with a maximum blending mode. And so what this does is it'll take all the brightest pixels in the stack rather than the average of the pixels. So then your lunar edge is actually going to be more of an egg shape rather than a streaked moon. And so then with that moon mask I talked about, I subbed in the pixels from the maximum image into the average image just where the moon moved. And you get a little bit of hot pixel issues there with the maximum stacking, but that's something a noise reduction filter later can help with. And so then I use those those master exposure images to then do my HDR blend.
Okay. Yeah, I think
Hopefully
I
that
just
makes sense.
yeah, I think in my so I took like a moon from one of the images and I just made it a little bit bigger.
Hey, I'm guilty as well. I did that in one of my pictures as well. It's so hard to get a clean moon edge in these pictures.
Yeah.
And I'm actually working on another method right now that I made some progress on that helps eliminate that issue by using some weight masks. So
Mm.
at some point after this, one of my friends and I are working on some tutorials that we may release to the public as well, so y'all can see some of these methods in action and hopefully help to understand them a little bit better. And I'll probably try to include that method as well once I get it finished.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. I think that's all the questions for now. Yeah. All right. Go ahead.
Thanks, Molly. Great questions, y'all. Thanks for asking. All right, so all of our pictures are aligned properly, and thank you all for asking the question about stacking photos. So now we're assuming we have a master sub-exposure for each one of your exposure values, and that's what we're going to blend into our HDR. So how do we combine them into one picture? That's where the HDR step comes in. So like I said earlier, the solar corona has an extreme brightness gradient from inner corona to outer corona, which is 14 stops dynamic range. So we need to merge all these bracketed pictures into one picture, but only keep the correctly exposed regions from each sub-exposure into the final picture. Like I mentioned earlier, so Miloslav Druckmuller plus his daughter Hannah Druckmuller-Vera, they both have released some papers that outline a linear HDR combination method, and it works really well for solar eclipse images. It's actually a lot simpler than a lot of other HDR algorithms you'll find online. And when I figured out how to actually implement it, it was like a eureka moment. I was overcomplicating it a lot. So hopefully I'll do some good explanations here as to what's actually going on. But the method blends the images in their linear state, meaning the images have not been stretched any. So it's very similar to how it comes out of the camera, which allows for maximum dynamic range preservation and the true relative brightness gradient of the moon or of the corona to actually be preserved, which is good from a scientific standpoint. So the baseline of the method is just a weighted average. So when you do an HDR combination, you think, well, let me just average all these pictures together and hopefully the final picture will be properly exposed, right? And that works. It's just the only issue you have is when you have these clipped regions that are overexposed and the clipped regions that are underexposed, that bad signal is going to be averaged together with your good signal. And so that's why you end up getting poor results from an average, just a standard average. And so a weighted average here lets us assign weights to each part of the corona and use that instead of just a straight weighted average. And so with this weight, we want to apply a weight function to this image that gives proper exposure a maximum weight, let's say 1, for example. And then any clipped regions like the moon and the inner corona that may be clipped and the outer corona that may be clipped, we'll give that a weight of 0. And anything in between will give a weight between 0 and 1. And so this, we can multiply each image by this. It'll remove, it'll just weight your, like in grade school, when you calculated your grade, it's a weighted average of all the pictures. So you get the best part of each picture according to the best weights of each image. So I'll go into a little bit more depth on that here. But here's the example weight function I used. This is pixel value on the x-axis. So your image input here is normalized between 0 and 1, and your weight here is on the left on the y-axis. So you can see here at, below maybe 0.1 or something, I've applied 0 weight to anything. And then between 0.1 and 0.65, I've given everything a weight of 1. And then past, let's say this is 0.95, anything past that value, I've given a weight of 0. And then in between those values, it's just, this is a Gaussian curve. So you can also use just a linear fit line, so just straight line down. I think either one would work fine. And so this is an example of a weight image here. You can see the properly exposed corona is given a weight of 1, and it slowly rolls off as you go out. I didn't remove the moon here, but that should also be removed in the weight image. And you can do that just by moon detection, which you can use a manual thing in Photoshop, or for me, I use something called the circle hue transform to remove that circle. So now that we've assigned our weights, we have to compensate for another issue. So there's another problem. In each one of our pictures, they're at a different exposure value, right? So, but it's of the same object. The corona, since all these pictures are aligned, one pixel at a given location represents the same location in the corona. So like I said down here, the same pixel index between exposures is the same location in the corona. So they should technically have the same brightness value in our pictures. However, because we took a range of exposure values, that pixel is going to be brighter or darker in different images. So this has to be compensated for. And you see here, I've taken 2 of my eclipse pictures, and I took a cross section across the middle, and I plotted the image value. See how we get slightly brighter and brighter and brighter as we approach the inner corona. You got the moon here in the middle. And so you see how the red image and the blue image, this is the same corona pixel. This is the same structure in the corona, but for some reason, we have 2 different brightness values, and that's because our exposure was longer. So this has to be compensated for. And a cool method to do that is actually already in PixInsight. It's called linear fit. So what you can do is here I've plotted on the left, I've plotted 6 images, what their horizontal cross section looks like. See how as the image gets brighter, the pixel values get larger as well. So what we do is we plot a reference image here on the y-axis, or sorry, I guess x-axis for reference image, and then we plot all the pixels in our target image on the y-axis. And if these images are still in their linear state, meaning they haven't been stretched, you'll actually get a very, very closely linear line. And you can find the slope and offset of that line, and that'll give you your offset and slope corrections for your images. So let's say we compare image 1 to image 2. The slope and offset here can be applied to image 2, and then it'll match image 1's brightness. And then you can match image 3 to image 1, and so on until you have all your pictures in the same brightness. Like I said, PixInsight already does this, so you can use their great tool there, and it's does a really good job rejecting outliers in the pictures that may show up, like noise. And so you can see here on the right, when I plot the same cross sections of our fitted images, you get a nice, smooth, aligned plot of what the corona looks like. And so this is really nice. And you see a lot of HDR techniques, if they don't perform this step, they have ringing. And so you see those, I call them isophotes. That's the word I learned a while back. You see those ringing artifacts if you don't perform this step. So a lot of HDR techniques you'll see out there, such as like the Debevec HDR method, they are dealing with nonlinear images from cameras, like your phone camera. If it's doing an HDR blend, it has to delinearize or it has to relinearize that picture before it can. I'm getting on a tangent here, but it has to bring that image back to linear before it does any calculations. And so if you read anything about those Debevec HDR methods, it'll be wildly more complicated than this because they have to do some other math involved. But if your images are linear, which I recommend staying in that area, this method will work more than enough. It's awesome. Okay, so we have our images exposure balanced. That's our M fit here. We have all the weights assigned to each picture. And I have to say, you determine the weights based on the images before you do a linear fit. Because when you do a linear fit to your images, the exposure values will go greater than 1. So you'll end up rejecting most of your picture. And so if we just apply, we multiply these weights by the fitted images, and then divide by the sum of all the weights, you get your HDR picture. It's a very simple formula, a little complicated to implement, but if you understand those two concepts of weighting and linear fit, it's very simple to implement. So here's what our HDR image would look like after a stretch. Okay. Before I get into this, any questions that have come up?
Oh yeah, there was one more that I missed. Have you had much success using PixInsight's fast Fourier transform registration script, the FFT registration?
So that's actually a good question. When I was early on trying to figure out this registration thing, I did try their registration. I tried it on both a regular total solar eclipse image and one of those pre-processed high-pass filtered images I showed y'all. It worked kind of well on the high-pass filtered image. It wasn't perfect. It gave me close enough results. But one of the issues I think that showed up was that Druckmüller's method is technically a modified phase correlation method. So it actually adds a term to the bottom of that cross correlation function. It's called a normalization constant. It just adds a really small number to the denominator of that equation that prevents division by 0. If you divide the Fourier transform, if one of your images when you take the Fourier transform has something close to 0, you'll get really large values in your cross correlation when you divide by 0. So Druckmüller recommended those normalization constants in the bottom. I believe earlier they were K and Q, maybe. I don't remember what the actual letters were, but that's the main difference between the two methods. So I think you could probably get it to work with PixInsight's phase correlation method. You'd have to manually do it for each one of your pictures, so that would be a little time consuming. But I did get it to work. It wasn't perfect, but yes, I would give it a try, and that would save you a lot of effort.
I think I had, like, when I tried it, it worked on some of the frames, but not all of them. But at least meant I had to line fewer of them.
Yeah, right. Now, I will say it's really good for aligning the moon. Yeah, the moon is crazy contrasty in all your pictures. So if you want to drop them all into the FFT or FFT registration in PixInsight, you could probably get a really easy Earthshine alignment that way.
Jonathan, what's your reference image for your linear fit?
So let's see. So the way I do it is I take my longest exposure picture. You can do it longest or shortest exposure. I prefer longest, just because when you store numbers in a matrix, you have a resolution that you have a certain amount of bits that you store, and I don't think you would ever reach that limit as far as a low enough number of exposure. I'm kind of rambling here, but I would prefer starting with the longer exposure and fitting all the shorter exposures to that rather than the other way around. I had more luck with it. There was less issues with noise in the low exposure picture, and there's more pixels available in those longer exposures to actually fit to. So what I do is I fit the longest picture, or I fit the second longest picture to the longest picture, and then apply that correction, and then fit the third longest exposure to the fitted second longest exposure. So I kind of go in a chain. So I go fit 2 to 1, 3 to 2, 4 to 3, and so on down the chain. I found that to work pretty well. You run the risk of propagating errors that way, but I've found the errors aren't large enough to cause too many issues if your linear fit is good enough. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
There's another question here from Matt Penn. Are your normalized boundaries for the weights the same for all your different exposures?
Yes. So I have found with images that either have a black border or something, like maybe you resized a high focal length image to fit into a wider focal length image. If you apply the same weight function to those images, you'll get a sharp boundary where the small image fits into the big one, and I can show an example of that later. So in that case, it may be beneficial to apply a different weight function, but most cases in general, you can apply the same weight function to all your images.
Okay. And then another one, or one from Andrew Hill, is the MFIT slope basically telling you how closely aligned the two images are?
Correct. Yeah. So when you look at this equation here, this is the y equals mx plus b we studied in school. So you got your slope, which is just a scaling factor, meaning it's just a multiplication constant. So you multiply every pixel in image X by 3.05. And then the overall shift in offset, which is, when you have a linear fit line, the area where that intersects this y-axis is just going to apply a global offset, regardless of what the pixel value is. So yeah, it basically scales and offsets the image to perfectly match the one it was fitted to.
Okay. I think that is it for now.
All right. Thanks for all the questions, y'all. These are really good questions. I appreciate y'all asking. All right. So the dynamic range of our HDR image is incredibly high. You see it here on the right. This is another horizontal cross section. You see the brightest pixels in our image are 4.5 compared to the dimmest ones are, almost 0. So it's really hard to visualize this without compressing this dynamic range somehow. So that's what the point of this is going to do. Is this is image tone mapping. You can also call this stretching or dynamic range compression. There are a lot of tools out there in PixInsight, Photoshop, all the things that can do this for you. I would recommend doing it in PixInsight because they can handle linear images. So currently our image looks like this if you display it at its brightness. So you can't see any outer corona. There's no details visible here. So we want to tone map this to show the details at all brightness values. There's a lot of methods you can do this with. There's the basic midtone shift, which is like your levels and your curves in Photoshop, which it works well with levels, but you see the inner corona is now saturated. Curves just destroys the picture. You can also use an algorithm like a Reinhardt or a Debevec tone mapping. These you can find online if you just Google those names. You'll see it's a whole algorithm-based approach to tone mapping. And like I said earlier, those are mainly for images that are nonlinear in state already. Our image is linear, so we can just normally apply a normal equation to it, and it'll do a great job. And in PixInsight, you got arcsine H, generalized hyperbolic stretch, and then you can also use what's called a log equation to do it as well. And you see the difference here between a log and a levels stretch is unbelievable. I'm going to focus on the log stretch because it closely resembles how the corona looks to our eyes. You can also use GHS in PixInsight or arcsine H stretch. Those are excellent things that will give you very similar results, especially with color. Okay, so a log stretch. This basically maps all the pixels in your image to the logarithm of their value. So you see, here's our original picture, a cross section. If we take the log of that image plus 1, because you avoid values by 0, and you multiply your image by a certain amplification value, this isn't really necessary. I use it just for visualization because I like rescaling my images to be within 0 and 1. I usually use a value of like 1,000,000 here, amplification value of 1,000,000. And that gets this outer corona value here more similar to the value up here before you take the log. And so this is really simple. You just, in MATLAB, you just go log parenthesis 1 plus your image, and it'll map your image to something that looks like this. And so when you visualize that, you see we can see the inner corona and outer corona at the same time without clipping the inner corona. And this is the basis of how I stretch all my pictures. You see it does amplify the noise a little bit, but in comparison to the signal, it's still much lower. Okay, so before we get into enhancement, this is a really big one. Are there any other questions that have popped up?
Let's see. No, not yet.
Awesome. Okay, this is the fun part. So now we have a nicely visualized HDR image of the eclipse. How do we bring out every bit of detail that's hidden within that corona? So you see earlier how I mentioned you can barely see these structures in here. You can see a little bit of streamers here and there and maybe some loops in here, but the structures are not visualized very well. So low contrast in our structural details We want to enhance all the structures of the corona by enhancing local contrast. And what I mean by local contrast is instead of the image's overall contrast, where you move the slider in Photoshop and it darkens the dark areas and brightens the bright areas, we want to enhance local contrast. So the small changes in brightness in a given area of the image. We want to do that everywhere. And we want to do it in the direction that the coronal structures are oriented. So the coronal structures are oriented radially out from the sun and tangentially around the sun. And so their direction changes almost like spokes on a wheel. And so we want to enhance those features specifically. We also want to preserve the integrity of the moon edge, so we don't want to blur that. We don't want to overemphasize it or cause any ringing artifacts, and we want to preserve the integrity of the prominences and stars as well. So I will detail some methods for that here in a moment. So an awesome foolproof method for enhancing local contrast is called an unsharp mask. And this is a very, very simple technique used in pretty much every bit of image processing out there you see. And it's basically where you subtract a blurred image from the original image. And it basically, the only details that are remaining are these high frequency details. And this is basically what a high pass filter is doing in general. So then this detail only image can then be added to your original image via like a soft light blending mode or just straight addition if you're using MATLAB. So normal unsharp masking, and like I said earlier, you can actually do this in Photoshop. You can go to filter and high pass, and it'll give you a great high pass filter. That's how I generated this one. But you see there's these big ringing artifacts. There's several problems. The ringing artifacts is one, and that's going to show up at any high contrast edge. And then the other issue is normal convolution kernels where you blur an image operate in the X and Y directions. So up, down, left, right. But remember I mentioned earlier that the structures in our corona are radially and tangentially oriented. So there's a chance when we enhance structures in X and Y, it may be going perfectly oriented here, but when you get down to this area of the corona, you're not going to be enhancing anything because you're moving away from the correct direction. So we'll address both those issues here in a second. So the two methods that Druckmuller has laid out in one of his papers are called partial convolution and a spatially variable convolution kernel. I'll detail these more here in a second, but basically these are a partial convolution is a convolution that is normalized based on a mask instead of a kernel sum, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And a spatially variable kernel is instead of having the same kernel at every location of your picture, we're going to change it based on the location. And I'll show some cool diagrams that will hopefully help visualize that here in a moment. So first we'll go over the spatially variable convolution kernel. A kernel is just a weighting matrix, essentially. Convolution is primarily talked about as a frequency domain operation, but here we're going to work in the spatial domain, just without doing any Fourier transforms, and we'll define a convolution as a pixel by pixel weighting operation. And so a kernel, in the case of a convolution, is a weighting matrix used to compute an output pixel value based on the values of a input image's neighborhood. I know it's a lot to probably, if you're not familiar with this, probably a lot to deconstruct right now, but I'll have some cool diagrams that'll hopefully explain what I'm talking about. And most 2D kernels, if they're symmetric, can be decomposed into their components. Meaning if we have this peak here, this blurry dot, we can decompose it into a vertical kernel and a horizontal kernel. And if we multiply these two matrices together, we'll get back our 2D kernel. This is what a kernel looks like. It's just a big matrix full of numbers, just like all of our images are. And what you do is you apply this kernel to a specific location on the image. It takes the weighted average of everything around it, and it makes that the output image pixel value. And so when you blur, you use a kernel like this, and it blurs. It basically takes the average of all the adjacent pixels, and then uses that as the blurred pixel value in your output image. So here's a visualization. So we have this picture of a bullseye here, and this diagram here just means convolution. If we convolve this image with a one-directional kernel in the vertical direction, you see how our blurred image is only blurred vertically. So you see our vertical line is not blurred at all, and our vertical parts of our circle are not blurred at all. Similarly, if we blur with a horizontal kernel only, you see horizontal line is not blurred, but everything else is. So if we combine these two kernels into a 2D kernel, we get the blurred image you're familiar with. And like I said earlier, these can be applied via filter, blur, Gaussian blur in Photoshop, and it can create a very similar effect as this. So those kernel components, if we're talking in Cartesian, just X and Y coordinates here, those components are going to be oriented the same direction everywhere. No matter where your kernel or wherever your pixel is in the image, your kernel components are going to be X and Y. They'll be up and down, left, right. Since we want to blur in the radial and tangential directions, we have to figure out a way to orient these kernel components with respect to the way the corona is shaped. So everywhere they need to be facing like spokes on a tire. So if we orient this kernel in heliocentric polar coordinates, that heliocentric just means centered on the sun, polar coordinates instead of Cartesian coordinates, they will now be oriented in the way we want them to be. So instead of x, y, we want to orient in radius and angle. And so I'll show you all how to do that here in a second. So one of the ways of doing this is to physically unwrap the image that you have into polar coordinates based on a chosen centroid. And this is a little complicated to visualize. It actually took me about a year to figure out what was going on. But there's a ton of functions that actually do this out there. So they'll already perform this conversion for you automatically. And I think PixInsight has one as well. So if you want to use that, you can. But for an example here, we have our Cartesian image. These are the row indices and column indices. So, row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, so on, all the way down. And same with the rows here, row 1, 2, 3, 4. If we inscribe a circle, we want to warp this image to polar coordinates. So if you use a polar transformation, like one of these functions in MATLAB or OpenCV or PixInsight, and we warp our image to polar coordinates, if we follow this red circle, this red line in this picture down here is representing the circle. You see, we start here on the right. Our image goes from red to yellow to green to blue to dark blue, and then back to green, yellow, orange, red. If we start here, we go the same order of colors here. So we know that this is the constant circle in our Cartesian image. Same with the polar rows. If you follow a circle here, you'll see the same thing appear here in the row indices of the polar image. I know this is a little complicated, but it'll make a little more sense in the next diagram here. So if we take our bullseye image and we warp it to polar coordinates, you see these concentric circles are now parallel lines across the width of the image. And these vertical and horizontal lines you see here are now vertical lines in the polar image. There's a little bit of a warping issue here because I didn't have the correct center, but the concept's there. And if you see, we take an eclipse image, we apply the centroid as the center of the moon, and we warp it to polar coordinates. You see now all of our coronal structures are aligned vertically in this picture, and the moon takes up this top half of the picture. So if we blur now in the X and the Y direction of this picture, when we warp it back to Cartesian coordinates, it will represent a circle and a radial direction blur. So you can see here is if we blur left and right, it will, when we warp back to Cartesian coordinates, it will blur along a circle because the pixel values here represent each circle in the image at each radius. And if we blur up and down, we will blur the image here outwards from the image center. So I'm going to give another illustration here, and this will hopefully help visualize what's going on. So between a normal Cartesian domain convolution and a polar domain convolution, we got a grid of dots here, and this will hopefully help us visualize what's going on. So you see here on the top, if we blur in the left, right, up and down directions, see our dots look blurry in those directions. But if we warp this image to polar coordinates first, and then apply our blur, and then warp it back, see now our dots are blurred radially outwards from the center, and in a circle centered on the center of the image. This is exactly how the corona needs to be blurred as well. So if we subtract our blurred corona image, blurred in this polar manner, from the unblurred image, it'll produce an unsharp mask, very similar to what we saw earlier, but with the proper orientation of the structures blurred. You won't notice a huge difference in the inner corona, but the outer corona, you'll see a large difference in noise amount because that blur is properly oriented. So even with this adaptive kernel that blurs in the correct directions, we still see the ringing artifacts because we're still blurring across this moon edge. And this is the issue that can be addressed with something called partial convolution. So any questions real quick on the polar transformation before we move on to partial convolution?
No, but your illustrations are super helpful for understanding all this.
Awesome, thank you.
Just saying.
Jonathan?
I am so visual, so if I don't have a picture, I'm not going to understand. So I hope these are
Jonathan?
helpful to y'all. Yeah.
How much more do you have to go?
Just a few more slides. Let's see, I got 6 more slides.
All right, we're running a little long, but we're anxious to get to the final image.
Yeah.
Actually, sorry, I told y'all wrong. I have about 10 more slides. Sorry, I'll pick up the pace a little bit.
Okay, thanks.
A lot of content, so I appreciate y'all bearing with me. Okay, so partial convolution. You have normal convolution in which that kernel that I showed y'all earlier is normalized, so there's no change in brightness to the convolved image, meaning the sum of the pixels in that kernel are equal to 1. In partial convolution, we don't normalize that kernel before we do convolution. We instead blur a mask that represents pixels that don't need to be in the convolution, and we normalize the final image based on that mask instead. You see a 2D representation here. The normally blurred image is here in teal, and the data is in black. So with normal convolution, we get a smeared boundary. Partial convolution, we get a nice sharp edge. So ignore this formula for now. Partial convolution is actually very simple. It's just a division between 2 convolutions. So what you need is your image, a kernel, and then a mask that's equal to 0 for pixels you don't want to include in the convolution, and 1 everywhere else. So we would denote the moon, the prominences, and the stars as 0 in the mask, and everything else would be equal to 1. So what we do to do a partial convolution is we multiply our image by that mask, which basically forces all these pixels to 0 that we don't want to include. We apply the same convolution to that mask that we used, and then we divide the convolved masked image by the convolved mask, and then replace any pixels in the mask with 0 that are restricted by the mask with 0. You can see a 2D representation here. Normal data is nice and noisy. The mask is just the data and none of this black boundary. A normal convolution blurs that boundary. Then our partial convolution nicely blends out the noise without affecting that boundary. So there's again, that 1D example I showed y'all. And here is the 2D example. So you see our boundary issue we had earlier with normal convolution, and then our partial convolution example here. There's still a little bit of a residual here because my mask was actually not perfect, but you see the prominent shape is actually showing up now. And you'd see something similar in the outer corona with stars if that was in here as well. Okay, so how do we enhance our image? We can generate a set of these filters at multiple scales, like was mentioned earlier, and then we can combine those filters with the log mapped image earlier in a linear combination to then enhance our final picture. So what I usually do is these octave spacing, so 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, so on. I generate a filter at each one of these sizes with the methods I just talked about, and then I apply something called an amplification factor. I just multiply each one of those filters by a scalar value, so like 10 or 5 or 25, and it'll increase the amount that has on the final image. And you just add each one of these unsharp masks to your original log mapped image, and it'll give you an enhanced image. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. You got a 2 pixel high pass filter here, a 4 pixel, an 8 pixel, and a 16 pixel. See how the structures get larger. If we add all these together with these scale factors here, you see we get great emphasis on the outer corona and the nice small sharp details at the same time. So now what we can do is we can add this picture to our pristine log mapped image, And there you go. There's the enhanced eclipse image. So that's excellent there. We still have a couple other things we need to add. So, we want to add back in our stars, earth shine, and our prominences. These things I don't have an official method for right now numerically, so I just use Photoshop. You can apply a large high pass filter in Photoshop to isolate these stars, and then use Star Exterminator or StarNet to isolate the stars and then layer them back on top of your eclipse image. Earthshine, like we talked about earlier, you can stack a separate picture in PixInsight using the FFT registration method, or just your own in Photoshop. And then you can make a circle mask and layer that over top your sharpened image. I find that isolating the moon in your picture is easy if you use a large size high pass filter and camera raw clarity, dehaze, and contrast. Those are great ways to make the moon stand out a lot more before you mask it in. And then prominences can be added in as well using similar methods. You can enhance those using camera raw sharpening or some other programs that Druckmuller has released if you ever wanted to look into those. Okay. In summary here, here's all of our steps. We got our pictures we took. We registered them to make sure they were all in the right location spatially. We combined them via an HDR. We generated a set of high pass filters, isolated our stars and our earth shine, and we added all those back into the log mapped HDR image, and there's our output. It still takes a lot of work after you generate these filters, but the end result is a lot easier to get to than using Photoshop alone. So I'm going to go ahead and give some credits where they're due. There's a lot of awesome folks I've been working with for all this stuff. Francois, Dipanshu, David, Colin, Ludo, all you guys are amazing. I'm so grateful for y'all's partnership in helping implement these techniques, and for all the long conversations we've had about this stuff. Y'all are awesome. And a special thanks to Colin as well for his mentorship before the eclipse. He gave me a lot of these capture techniques, and I really appreciate him for also contributing to rental gear costs. Wouldn't have been able to do any of this without you, so I'm very grateful. And a special thanks to you guys at the Astro Imaging channel for inviting me on. Here is each one of the references that I have. And if you go back through the recording, you'll see each one of these are labeled in the bottom left of the slide. So if you go to these URLs or the papers here, if you search them in Google, you can find those. And here's where to find me. I think Molly mentioned earlier, all of these should be in the description of the live stream. But feel free, if you have any other questions or want to get in contact with me in the future, shoot me a DM or a message on AstroBin. And if you want, you can read the entire story with some other fun inside details of the eclipse here at this URL. So that is all I got, though. Thank you guys for listening and tuning in. I appreciate your time.
A couple questions to finish from the chat. This one is, so you have to take the image from Cartesian to polar in order to see these prominences that extend from the corona?
So you can emphasize the structures in the corona without doing a polar transformation, but you'll have poor noise performance in the outer corona in particular. The difference between an image that's sharpened like this here and just a high pass filter in Photoshop is that polar transformation. So it will emphasize those prominences as well as the streamers and everything. So I would recommend doing a polar transformation. You can do high pass filtering just in Photoshop, though. It's just not as clean.
Okay.
You can stop sharing if you want, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you.
And then Elizabeth wants to know, why do you have to have a scale factor for each filter, and how do you know what it needs to be?
Let's see.
At the bottom, there's a stop sharing button.
Yes, sir. There we go. There we go. Okay. Cool. So, sorry, what was that question, Molly?
Yeah. Why do you have to have a scale factor for each filter, and how do you know what it needs to be?
It's just trial and error. It's also personal preference. Usually your high frequencies, like your small size filters, 2 pixel, 4 pixel, those you're going to want to emphasize a lot more. So you would use a larger scale factor. You can just linearly combine everything with no scaling factors too. But if you want to enhance the amount that each filter is applied to your image, that's when the scaling factors come in. And usually they're decreasing, and your large scale filters don't need as much amplification as your low size or high frequency filters do.
If you want to add these together in Photoshop, the high pass filters, how would you do that if you just want to add layers together?
So there's a couple ways that I've seen you can do it. Soft light blending is how you blend in that high pass filter. But the way to amplify it is to either create a duplicate of that layer. So you got your image and you got your high pass filter here. If you want to increase the amount that's applied, you can either duplicate that several times, and it'll increase that's effectively the multiplication that I was talking about, or you can take a levels adjustment and bring in the levels on that high pass filter, and it'll also perform something very similar.
Yeah, so that would be by trial and error, since I don't think there's a numeric value to bring in.
Correct. Yeah. It would just be but how much you wanted to visually sharpen the image.
Well, there's no doubt about it. I mean, that's just an incredible image. I'm
Thank
not sure all of us, at least not me, followed all of the math, but it certainly should give anyone some ideas to go back and relook at some of their data to try to generate a little bit more detail. How clear were the skies where you were to take the image?
So it's actually pretty amazing. So we woke up, we drove out to about an hour away from our hotel, and it was completely cloudy, fogged over 100% while we were driving out to the eclipse. And when we got to our location, the clouds started clearing, and up until the moment of totality, there were still some clouds in the sky. But when totality came through, you got that breeze from, I guess, the cool air coming in from the umbra zone, and that blew all the clouds out of the way for totality. So it was still a little hazy, but not nearly as cloudy as I thought it would be. So I'm very thankful that all that took place.
Yeah, where we were, I think there were enough high clouds that I don't think anyone got earthshine out of their
Mhm.
images. But I don't know whether going back and looking at it would make any difference. I couldn't get any. Molly, I don't think you got any earthshine out of it.
No, I didn't.
No.
Yeah, the
That
earth
was-
shine's tough. If you got any thin high clouds, it's gonna be really hard to resolve that.
Yeah.
So, and also one side note, Francois and I may be releasing some either demos or tutorials about this kind of stuff online at some point. So it would save, some of y'all, if y'all wanted to experience if y'all wanted to mess around with the coding, it would save y'all having to do it yourselves. I don't know when that's going to be, but just I guess stay tuned, and I'll share some things on my socials if it's ever available out there.
Well, I know a lot of our not math experts are thinking right now. You know what the question's going to be, right?
I think
Couldn't
so.
you put this in a GUI?
I have, yes. So I'm actually working on that now with Francois. We're trying to put all these methods right into a GUI. I hate working in the MATLAB terminal. It's a lot easier to click a button and it happened for you. So, and who knows, we may release some of this stuff. So just keep following along, and you may get a working app at some point.
we can all punch buttons, but I think navigating some parts of this would be extremely difficult and a long learning process. But it's just no arguing with the result. And I think you have piqued a lot of people's interest to go back and relook at their data and say, maybe there's a little more detail than I know I'm thinking about it. You can't do the math. Some of the way you use the high pass filtering. The radial blur might give me a headache, but I might figure that out.
And funny enough, you can actually do that in Photoshop too. There's a radial spin blur.
Yeah.
Yeah, Molly, shake your head. She knows.
I was thinking about that.
Yeah, I've done a mathematical, so for the 2017 eclipse, I did what's called the pellet method in Photoshop, which is a lot of this kind of math using like creating some like the I'm trying to remember the name, like kind of the grayscale images from earlier with the different levels of detail for the different high pass filter levels and stuff like that. And then like you do some adding and some multiplying and some radial blurs, and it worked great in 2017 and 2019. It did not work great for 2024 because of the high thin clouds, which made I got that like those isophote ringing artifacts.
Yeah, that's really hard. Those high clouds are the worst,
Yeah.
in all astro things.
Yeah.
Well,
when and if you get those tutorials built, get anything posted, stuff like that, shoot us an email and then we can add it to the video description for this so people can who are looking for this in the future can find it.
Yeah, I absolutely will.
So I think we've kind of come to the end of our presentation.
We've got one more question here.
Oh, okay, Molly.
From Matt, are you going to Africa in 2027?
Oh man. Okay. So I think we talked about this on this chat last week actually. So I'd like to. So my wife and I, we want to go to the next couple eclipses. You know, there's 2026, 7, and 8. We definitely are going for Australia.
Australia, yes.
Yes, I'm not sure if we'll go to the one in 2027. I may look at seeing if I can work with somebody who already lives there. It may be a little easier to navigate. 2026 may be kind of cool because it's going to be on the horizon during totality, which would be really unique photographically. We'll
Yeah.
see. We'll see if I find my way to Africa for 2027.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
Are
I'm
we
gonna
all
poke
set,
around
Molly?
at Spain for 2026. Yeah, just a lot of kudos, really throughout the presentation and here at the end. People really enjoyed your presentation. Excellent job. All kinds of kudos. So
Thanks so
And
much,
yeah,
everybody. I really appreciate y'all coming to log on with us and enjoy the stream. And like I said, if you got any questions, shoot me an email or a DM or something.
I think
and
that's it for the
you know,
question.
Nathan, you can stay on after we close
Oh, yeah.
the online show.
Yes,
And I think we've kind of come to that point. Jamie, you're in charge. Jaime, I'm sorry I did it again. Jaime, you're in charge. Please take us out. And for all of you, we won't see you next week, but we'll see you in 2 weeks. So please enjoy the Super Bowl and then come back in 2 weeks. And I guess it's good night from all of us. So.
Good night.